Marcus had earned his reputation with blood and steel, a warrior whose name alone could silence a room full of hardened men. They called him the Blade of Fort Riverside, a man forged in the furnace of frontier warfare, where mercy was a luxury few could afford. The settlers whispered that he was carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mountains themselves, a force of nature that destroyed everything in his path. But they were wrong about one thing: Marcus wasn't meant to break Sarah Mitchell. He was meant to heal her, one careful, patient stitch at a time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Willow Creek like a shroud when Marcus first saw her sitting alone on the fallen log that served as an impromptu bridge across the narrow stream. Sarah Mitchell sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, staring into the water with eyes that held the weight of unspoken sorrow. Her auburn hair caught the early light, creating a halo effect that seemed almost ethereal against the backdrop of pine trees. There was something about her stillness that drew him, not the frozen immobility of fear, but the deliberate quiet of someone who had learned to find peace in solitude. Marcus had been returning from his weekly patrol of the northern boundaries, his horse's hooves making soft impressions in the damp earth of the creek bed. He should have ridden past, should have minded his own business as he always did, but something made him pull his mount to a halt behind a cluster of birch trees. Perhaps it was the way she sat so perfectly still while the world moved around her, or maybe it was the recognition of something familiar in her posture, the same careful control he had seen in his own reflection after particularly difficult missions. From his concealed position, Marcus could see that she was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with the kind of beauty that comes not from perfection, but from character etched into every line of her face. Her dress was simple but well made, the deep blue fabric speaking of a family with modest means, but good taste. What struck him most was not her appearance, but the careful way she held herself, as if she were made of something fragile that might shatter if handled too roughly. Sarah had no idea she was being observed as she performed what had become her morning ritual. Every day for the past 3 months, since the terrible news had arrived with the military courier, she had come to this spot to sit with her thoughts and try to make sense of a world that no longer made any sense at all. The creek's gentle babbling provided a steady rhythm that helped calm the chaos in her mind, and the solitude gave her permission to let her carefully constructed facade drop for just a few precious moments. The sound of a horse nickering softly in the distance made her stiffen, and she turned her head slightly, not enough to look directly behind her, but enough to listen more carefully. Marcus saw her shoulders tense and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Rather than riding away and leaving her to her privacy, he dismounted quietly and approached on foot, making enough noise to announce his presence. Without startling her, Sarah heard the footsteps and felt her heart begin to race, not with the pleasant flutter of romantic anticipation, but with the sharp spike of genuine fear. In her world, unexpected encounters with strange men rarely ended, while for women, especially women who were alone and vulnerable. She turned slowly, keeping her movements controlled and non-threatening, the way her father had taught her when dealing with potentially dangerous wildlife. Marcus emerged from the tree line with his hands clearly visible and empty, his rifle left secured to his saddle. He was taller than Sarah had expected, with the kind of presence that filled a space even when he was trying to minimize it. His dark hair was longer than military regulation typically allowed, suggesting either a relaxed commanding officer or a man who operated outside the usual constraints of army life. His clothes were practical rather than decorative, leather and wool chosen for durability rather than appearance, but they were clean and well maintained, speaking of personal discipline and attention to detail. What surprised Sarah most was his face. She had expected the harsh, weathered features of a man hardened by violence, But while there were certainly lines around his eyes that spoke of difficult experiences, there was also a gentleness in his expression that caught her off guard. His eyes were a warm brown, the color of rich earth, and they held none of the predatory gleam she had learned to watch for in dangerous men. Marcus stopped at what he judged to be a respectful distance, close enough to speak without raising his voice, but far enough away that she wouldn't feel cornered or threatened. His years of military service had taught him to read body language like a map, and everything about Sarah's posture told him that she was prepared to run at the first sign of aggressive behavior. He had seen that same careful wariness in the eyes of wounded animals, and it stirred something protective in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. "Good morning," he said quietly, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who was more accustomed to giving orders than making. "Pleasant conversation. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I was just passing through and wanted to make sure you were safe out here alone. These woods can be unpredictable, especially in the early hours." Sarah studied his face carefully, looking for the telltale signs of deception or hidden intentions that she had become expert at detecting. What she found instead was genuine concern mixed with what appeared to be awkwardness, as if he were as uncertain about this interaction as she was. His posture was relaxed but alert, the stance of someone who was prepared for trouble, but not expecting it. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her system. "I come here often, and I've never had any trouble." Her words were polite but distant, establishing boundaries without being overtly rude. She had learned the delicate balance between courtesy and self-preservation in the months since her world had been turned upside down. Marcus nodded, accepting her response without challenge or argument. He could have pointed out that the fact that she had never encountered trouble before was no guarantee of future safety, or mentioned the increasing reports of hostile activity in the surrounding areas, but something in her manner told him that she was already carrying enough burden without adding his concerns to the load. "Of course," he said simply. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that these are uncertain times, and I'd hate for anything to happen to someone who clearly knows how to take care of herself." The compliment was subtle but genuine, acknowledging her competence rather than her vulnerability. Sarah felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. In her experience, dangerous men either ignored women entirely or focused on their weaknesses as potential opportunities. The stranger had done neither, instead offering respect for her judgment, while expressing concern for her welfare. It was a combination she hadn't encountered often, and it left her feeling slightly off balance in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. "Are you from the fort?" she asked, not because she particularly wanted to continue the conversation, but because something about his presence made the silence feel more noticeable than usual. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His clothes and bearing suggested military service, but there was something about him that seemed different from the soldiers she occasionally saw in town. Marcus hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "I am, though I spend most of my time away from the main post. I scout the northern territories, keeping track of movement and activity that might affect the settlers in this area." It was a simplified version of the truth, but an accurate one. He saw no need to mention that much. Of his work involved tracking down and eliminating threats before they could reach communities like Riverside. Sarah absorbed this information, filing it away with the other details she had collected about him in the few minutes of their acquaintance. A scout made sense. It explained his comfortable relationship with the wilderness and his ability to move quietly through the forest. It also suggested that he was trusted with independent operations, which meant he was likely both competent and reliable, qualities that were not as common as they should be among the men stationed at frontier posts. "Thank you for checking on me," she said finally, the words carrying more genuine warmth than her previous responses. It was kind of you to take the time, even though it wasn't necessary. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirts with practiced movements. And Marcus could see that she was preparing to leave. He should have let her go. Every instinct trained into him by years of military service told him that getting involved with civilians, especially female civilians, was a complication he couldn't afford. His work required a clear head and complete focus, and emotional entanglements had a way of clouding judgment at the worst possible moments. But as he watched Sarah gather herself to depart, something deeper than training or common sense compelled him to speak. "Would it be presumptuous of me to ask your name?" he said, question coming out more formally than he had intended. "I'd like to know who I was worried about if I find myself passing this way again in the future." Sarah paused in her preparations to leave, considering his request. Giving her name to a stranger was a small thing, barely more than basic courtesy. But in her current state of mind, even small gestures felt significant. There was something about his manner, however, that made the request feel safe rather than intrusive. "Sarah Mitchell," she said simply, offering no additional information about her family or circumstances. The name hung in the air between them. Like a bridge, neither was quite ready to cross. "Marcus," he replied, completing the exchange. "Marcus Cole." The formality of the introduction seemed to satisfy some requirement of proper behavior for both of them, creating a foundation upon which future interactions could be built if they chose to pursue them. Sarah nodded politely, a gesture that managed to convey both acknowledgement and dismissal. "It was nice to meet you, Marcus Cole. I hope your patrols continue to be safe and successful." She turned to go, but something made her pause and look back over her shoulder. "If you do happen to pass this way again, you're welcome to stop and rest. The creek is peaceful, and sometimes we all need a moment of peace." With that, she walked away through the trees, leaving Marcus standing alone by the water with the distinct feeling that something important had just happened, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. He watched until she disappeared from sight, then stood for several more minutes listening to the sound of the creek and trying to understand why a simple conversation with a stranger had left him feeling more unsettled than a week of dangerous patrol work. As Sarah made her way back toward town, she found herself thinking about the encounter in ways that surprised her. For months, she had been moving through her days like a sleepwalker, performing the necessary functions of daily life, without really engaging with the world around her. The conversation with Marcus had been the first time in recent memory that she had felt truly present in a moment, responding to another person rather than simply enduring their presence. There had been something in his manner that reminded her of who she used to be before the letter arrived that changed everything. The Sarah of 6 months ago would have been curious about a mysterious scout, would have asked questions about his work and his travels, would have enjoyed the novelty of an unexpected encounter with an interesting stranger. The fact that she could still remember that version of herself, could still access that capacity for engagement, felt like a small miracle. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself taking a longer route back to the fort than usual, his mind occupied with thoughts of Auburn, hair and careful politeness. He had encountered hundreds of civilians in his years of service, had protected them and guided them, and occasionally had to deliver terrible news to them. But he couldn't remember any single encounter affecting him the way those few minutes by the creek had done. There had been something about Sarah Mitchell that spoke to him on a level he didn't entirely understand. Perhaps it was the way she had maintained her composure while clearly being nervous, or the careful courtesy that suggested good breeding despite modest circumstances. More likely, it was the recognition of something familiar in her eyes, a kind of controlled sadness that he had seen in his own mirror on particularly difficult mornings. Whatever the reason, Marcus found himself hoping that their paths would cross again, and that when they did, Sarah Mitchell might be willing to share more than just her name. He had no business getting involved with a civilian, especially one who was clearly dealing with her own challenges, But as he rode through the familiar forest paths toward the fort, he was already planning his next patrol route, to include a stop by Willow Creek. Neither of them could have predicted that this simple encounter would become the first thread in a tapestry that would ultimately redefine both their lives, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest gestures of human kindness. The warrior who was supposed to break everything in his path had instead found something worth protecting, and the woman who had been broken was about to discover that healing comes not from avoiding pain, but from finding someone patient enough to help you stitch your heart back together, one careful thread at a time. The morning sun climbed higher as both Sarah and Marcus went about their separate days, neither knowing that they had just taken the first steps down a path that would challenge everything they thought they knew about strength, vulnerability, and the transformative power of unexpected gentleness in a world that often rewarded only hardness and suspicion. 3 days passed before Marcus found a legitimate reason to return to Willow Creek, though he could have easily fabricated one sooner if he had been willing to admit to himself what he was doing. The Northern Territories were vast, and his patrol routes could reasonably include any number of paths through the wilderness, but he had spent those 3 days telling himself that his interest in returning to that particular stretch of water had nothing to do with a woman named Sarah Mitchell, and everything to do with thorough reconnaissance of the area. The truth, which he was steadfastly avoiding, was that he had thought about their brief conversation at least once every hour since it had occurred. He found himself wondering what had brought such careful sadness to her eyes, what had taught her to hold herself with such deliberate control, and why a woman who was clearly intelligent and well-spoken was spending her mornings alone by a creek instead of engaging with the social life of Riverside. When he finally did make his way back to the familiar grove of birch trees, Marcus was both relieved and disappointed to find the fallen log empty. The creek continued its gentle babbling, indifferent to human presence or absence, and the morning light filtered through the leaves in exactly the same pattern as it had 3 days earlier. Everything was precisely as it had been, except for the absence of the one element that had made the scene memorable. Marcus had just decided that his disappointment was probably for the best when he heard the sound of quiet humming coming from further upstream. The melody was unfamiliar but pleasant, a simple tune that seemed to match the rhythm of the flowing water. He followed the sound, leading his horse carefully through the underbrush until he came to a small clearing where the creek widened into a shallow pool. Sarah was kneeling by the water's edge, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows as she worked to scrub what appeared to be a collection of root vegetables clean in the clear water. Her humming stopped abruptly when she became aware of his presence, and she looked up with the same careful wariness he had seen during their first encounter, though this time it seemed mixed with something that might have been recognition rather than pure alarm. "Mr. Cole," she said, settling back on her heels and smoothing her wet hands on the apron tied around her waist. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." Her tone was neutral, giving nothing away about whether his appearance was welcome or merely tolerable. "Miss Mitchell," Marcus replied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that felt more natural than he had expected it to. "I hope I'm not interrupting important work." He gestured toward the vegetables she had been cleaning, noting the care with which she had arranged them on a clean cloth beside the pool. "Not at all," Sarah said, though she made no move to resume her task. "I was just preparing these for my mother's garden soup. She makes it every week, and somehow the vegetables always taste better when they've been cleaned in creek water rather than from the well." It was a longer response than she had given him during their previous meeting, and Marcus took it as a cautiously encouraging sign. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," he said, dismounting and securing his horse to a nearby tree with practiced efficiency. "My grandmother used to say that food prepared with natural water held some of the earth's strength. I always thought it was just an old wives' tale until I spent time in the field and realized how much better simple meals taste when they're prepared with fresh spring water." Sarah looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected a military scout to have opinions about cooking or to reference female relatives with obvious affection. "You have a grandmother who cooks," she said, and it wasn't quite a question, but wasn't quite a statement either. Had Marcus corrected gently. "She passed away about 5 years ago, but she raised me after my parents died. She was the kind of woman who could make a feast out of whatever happened to be available. And she taught me that half the secret of good cooking is treating your ingredients with respect." He paused, then added, "She also taught me that the other half is cooking for people you care about. But that's a lesson I'm still working on understanding." There was something in his voice when he mentioned his grandmother that made Sarah look at him more carefully. The affection was clearly genuine, and there was a quality of loss that suggested her death had been significant to him in ways that went beyond simple grief. It was the first truly personal information he had shared, and Sarah found herself curious about what other layers might exist beneath his composed exterior. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than such conventional expressions usually did. Grandmothers who raise their grandchildren are often the strongest people in any family. Mine died when I was 12, but she taught me to sew and embroider, and I still use the technique she showed me whenever I need to mend something. The mention of mending seemed to hang in the air between them, with unexpected significance, though. Neither of them could have explained exactly why. Marcus found himself studying Sarah's hands, noticing for the first time that her fingers bore the small, precise scars that came from years of careful needlework. They were capable hands, he realized, hands that created and repaired rather than destroyed. "What kind of things do you mend?" he asked, genuinely curious. In his world, most repairs were rough and functional, designed to hold together long enough to complete a mission rather than to restore something to its original beauty. Sarah hesitated, then began gathering her clean vegetables back into their basket. "All sorts of things," she said finally. "Clothes, of course, but also household linens, curtains, anything that can be saved rather than thrown away. My family doesn't have the luxury of replacing everything that gets damaged, so I've become quite skilled at making old things useful again." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirts, and Marcus noticed that even this simple movement was performed with the same careful grace he had observed during their first meeting. There was something about the way Sarah moved through the world that suggested she was constantly aware of her surroundings and her impact on them, as if she had learned to minimize her presence in order to avoid drawing unwanted attention. "That's a valuable skill," Marcus said, falling into step beside her as she began walking back toward the main path. "In my line of work, we tend to break things more often than we fix them. It would be useful to know how to repair some of the damage we cause." Sarah glanced at him sideways, noting the slight tension that had crept into his voice when he mentioned his work. She had heard enough stories about military operations to understand that men like Marcus Cole probably carried burdens that went far beyond physical dangers, and she found herself wondering what it cost him to perform duties that required breaking rather than mending. "What exactly do you do when you're not patrolling?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw his expression close off slightly. "I don't mean to pry," she added quickly. "I just realized I don't really know what a scout's duties involve beyond riding around the countryside." Marcus was quiet for several steps, considering how much truth he was willing to share. The full extent of his responsibilities would likely horrify a civilian woman, but there were aspects of his work that he could discuss without revealing details that might disturb her sleep or change the way she looked at him. "Mostly I gather information," he said finally. "I track movement through the territories, identify potential threats to settlements, and report back to the fort commanders so they can make informed decisions about troop deployments and civilian warnings. Sometimes I guide supply convoys or help lost travelers find their way to safety. It's not glamorous work, but it serves an important purpose in keeping people safe." It was a carefully edited version of the truth, leaving out the parts about tracking down and eliminating hostile raiders, conducting reconnaissance for military strikes, and delivering ultimatums to tribal leaders who were threatening settler communities. Those aspects of his job were necessary, but they were not the parts of himself he wanted Sarah Mitchell to know about. Sarah seemed to accept his explanation without suspicion, nodding thoughtfully as they continued walking. "It sounds lonely," she said after a moment. "All that riding through empty country with only your horse for company. Don't you ever wish you had someone to talk to during those long days?" The question struck Marcus as surprisingly perceptive, touching on something he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Loneliness was a luxury he couldn't afford to indulge when his survival depended on maintaining complete focus on his surroundings. But there were certainly moments during long patrols when he found himself missing the simple pleasure of conversation with another human being. Sometimes, he admitted, but solitude has its advantages too. It teaches you to be comfortable with your own thoughts, and it makes you appreciate human companionship more when you do encounter it. Like this morning, for instance. I've been writing alone for 4 days, so our conversation feels particularly valuable to me. Sarah felt something flutter in her chest at his words, a sensation she hadn't experienced in months, and wasn't entirely sure how to interpret. There was something about Marcus Cole that drew her out of the careful isolation she had constructed around herself, something that made her want to engage with the world in ways she had forgotten were possible. They had reached the edge of the forest where the path split to lead either toward town or back toward the creek. Sarah paused, shifting her basket to her other arm, and looked at Marcus with an expression that seemed to be considering something important. "Mr. Cole," she said slowly, "I want to thank you for being so kind during our conversations. I haven't been very sociable lately, and I hope you don't think my reserve has anything to do with you personally. You've been nothing but respectful and pleasant, and I appreciate that more than you might realize." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest at her words, recognizing the careful way she was explaining herself without actually explaining anything. Whatever had made Sarah Mitchell withdraw from social interaction was clearly significant, and the fact that she felt compelled to apologize for her natural caution suggested that other people had made her feel guilty for protecting herself. "Miss Mitchell," he said gently, "you don't owe me any explanations or apologies. Everyone has reasons for the way they navigate the world, and I wouldn't presume to judge yours. I'm just grateful that you've been willing to share these few minutes of conversation with me. They've been the brightest part of several otherwise routine days." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah found herself looking at him with new attention. In her experience, men who claimed to be understanding usually expected something in return for their patience, but there was nothing in Marcus's manner that suggested he was trying to manipulate her gratitude into something more personal. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying more meaning than their brevity suggested. "I should go now. My mother will be wondering what happened to her vegetables." She started to turn away, then paused and looked back. "Will you be patrolling this area again soon?" The question was asked with studied casualness, but Marcus detected genuine interest beneath the neutral tone. "Most likely next week," he said, trying to match her casual manner. "The northern boundaries require regular monitoring, and this route provides good coverage of the most vulnerable approaches to town." Sarah nodded, as if his answer was exactly what she had expected to hear. "Well, if you do happen to pass by the creek again, I'm usually here in the mornings. The solitude is peaceful, and sometimes it's nice to know that someone else appreciates the beauty of this place." With that, she walked away toward town, leaving Marcus standing at the fork in the path with the distinct impression that he had just been issued a very polite invitation. As he watched her figure disappear around a bend in the road, he found himself already planning his next patrol schedule to ensure that it would include another morning stop at Willow Creek. Part 3. The Call to Connection. The following week brought unseasonably warm weather to the Montana Territory, the kind of early spring sunshine that made even the most practical people dream of possibilities beyond their daily routines. Sarah found herself waking earlier than usual, drawn by some inexplicable urge to spend more time outdoors before the demands of household duties claimed her attention. She told herself that her increased interest in morning walks had nothing to do with the possibility of encountering a certain military scout, but she was careful to choose her best walking dress and to braid her hair with more attention than strictly necessary for a solitary excursion. When she arrived at the creek on Tuesday morning, Sarah was surprised to find Marcus already there, sitting on a fallen log with his horse grazing peacefully nearby. He appeared to be sketching something in a small leather-bound notebook, his attention focused completely on the page before him. Sarah hesitated at the edge of the clearing, uncertain whether to approach or retreat, when Marcus looked up and caught sight of her. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell," he said, closing the notebook and standing with the same careful courtesy he had shown during their previous meetings. "I hope you don't mind that I arrived early today. The sunrise over the water was too beautiful to ignore, and I thought I might try to capture some of it on paper." Sarah moved closer, curious despite herself about this unexpected revelation of artistic interest. "You draw?" she asked, noting the quality of the leather binding and the obvious care with which he handled the notebook. Marcus looked slightly embarrassed by the question, as if he had been caught engaging in some activity that was inconsistent with his professional identity. "Nothing very skillful," he said. "I started sketching during lawn patrols as a way to record landmarks and terrain features for my reports. But over time it became something I did for my own satisfaction rather than just for practical purposes." "May I see?" Sarah asked, then immediately worried that she was being presumptuous. "I mean, if you don't mind sharing. I've always been curious about how artists see the world differently from the rest of us." Marcus hesitated for a moment, then opened the notebook to a page that showed a detailed rendering of the creek as it appeared in early morning light, with every ripple and reflection captured in careful pencil strokes. The drawing was far more accomplished than his modest description had suggested, showing not just technical skill but a genuine sensitivity to the beauty of the natural world. "This is remarkable," Sarah said, studying the image with genuine admiration. "You've captured something about this place that I recognize but could never have put into words. It's not just what the creek looks like, but how it feels to be here in the quiet hours." Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest at her praise, surprised by how much her opinion mattered to him. He had never shared his sketches with anyone before, had always thought of them as a private indulgence rather than something worthy of another person's attention. The fact that Sarah not only appreciated the technical aspects, but understood the emotional content, made him feel seen in a way that was both gratifying and slightly frightening. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more to me than you might realize. Most people don't expect soldiers to have interests beyond their military duties, and I've learned to keep this particular hobby to myself to avoid questions about how I have time for such pursuits." Sarah looked at him with newfound understanding, recognizing the careful compartmentalization that allowed him to maintain different aspects of his identity without having them interfere with each other. It was a strategy she understood intimately, having spent the last several months learning to present a functional facade to the world, while keeping her private struggles hidden from view. "I think people are often more complex than others give them credit for," she said thoughtfully. "We all have parts of ourselves that don't fit neatly into the roles other people expect us to play. The challenge is finding people who can appreciate the whole person rather than just the public version." Her words carried a weight that suggested personal experience, and Marcus found himself wondering again about the circumstances that had taught Sarah Mitchell to value privacy and authenticity so highly. There was something in her manner that spoke of hard-won wisdom, the kind that came from navigating situations where being truly known by others carried risks as well as rewards. Have you found that? He asked gently. People who appreciate the whole person, I mean. Sarah's expression grew distant for a moment, and Marcus could see her considering how much truth she was willing to share. Some people, she said finally. My family, certainly, though even they don't always understand all my choices. And there was someone who knew me very well, but that's no longer possible. The carefully controlled pain in her voice when she mentioned this unnamed person made Marcus's protective instincts stir, but he recognized that pressing for details would be both inappropriate and counterproductive. Instead, he found himself wanting to offer something of his own experience, some gesture of reciprocal vulnerability that might ease the loneliness he could hear beneath her composed words. I understand something about that, he said quietly. The work I do requires me to be many different things to different people, and sometimes I feel like I've forgotten which version of myself is the most genuine. It's been a long time since I've had conversations where I could just be Marcus rather than Scout Cole or Corporal Cole or whatever role the situation demands. Sarah looked at him with surprise, struck by the parallel between his experience and her own sense of fragmentation. She had been so focused on her own struggles with identity and authenticity that it hadn't occurred to her that someone who appeared as composed and self-assured as Marcus might be dealing with similar challenges. What does it feel like, she asked, when you get to just be Marcus? The question caught him off guard with its directness and its implicit assumption that such moments existed for him at all. He was quiet for a long moment, considering not just how to answer but whether he actually knew the answer himself. Peaceful, he said finally. Like I can stop calculating the risks of every word and action. Stop thinking 3 moves ahead. Stop being responsible for outcomes I can't control. It feels like breathing deeply after holding my breath for a very long time. He paused then, added with a slight smile, like sitting by a creek with someone who asks thoughtful questions and doesn't expect me to have all the answers. Sarah felt that flutter in her chest again, stronger this time and accompanied by something that might have been hope. There was something about Marcus Cole that called to parts of herself she had thought were permanently damaged, parts that still believed in the possibility of genuine connection despite everything that had happened to convince her otherwise. I like Marcus better than Scout Cole, she said softly, the admission surprising her with its honesty. Scout Cole seems very competent and reliable, but Marcus is more interesting. He draws pictures and remembers his grandmother's cooking advice and asks questions that make me think about things I've been avoiding. Marcus felt something shift inside him at her words, a loosening of defenses he hadn't realized he was maintaining. The careful distance he usually kept between himself and civilians was dissolving without his permission, replaced by something warmer and more dangerous, but also more alive than anything he had experienced in years. What kinds of things have you been avoiding? He asked, knowing that he was stepping across a line that he had previously been careful to observe, but finding that he no longer cared about the potential consequences. Sarah looked down at her hands, then back at his face, as if weighing the risks of honesty against the potential rewards of being truly known by another person. Everything, she said simply. Thinking about the future, making plans beyond getting through each day, believing that good things might still be possible for me. I've been living like someone who's just waiting for time to pass, rather than someone who has any real investment in what that time might bring. The raw honesty of her response hit Marcus like a physical blow, recognizing in her words an echo of his own relationship with hope and possibility. He had been existing rather than living for so long that he had almost forgotten the difference, moving through his days with competent efficiency, but no real sense of purpose beyond duty and survival. Why? He asked gently, though he suspected that the answer would involve painful territory that she might not be ready to explore with someone she barely knew. Sarah was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she wasn't going to answer, but when she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the obvious difficulty of the subject. I lost someone very important to me 6 months ago, she said carefully. Someone I was planning to spend my life with. The future I thought I was building disappeared overnight, and I haven't been able to figure out how to build a different one. Marcus felt his heart clench with sympathetic pain, understanding now the careful control he had observed in her manner and the sadness that lingered in her eyes even when she smiled. The death of a fiancé would certainly explain her withdrawal from social interaction and her reluctance to engage with thoughts of the future. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. That kind of loss changes everything about how the world looks and feels. There's no timeline for recovering from something like that, and no wrong way to navigate the process of rebuilding yourself afterward. Sarah looked at him with surprise, struck by the understanding in his voice and the absence of the platitudes she had grown accustomed to hearing from well-meaning friends and relatives. Most people either avoided the subject of her loss entirely, or offered cheerful reassurances about time healing all wounds and better days ahead. But Marcus seemed to grasp the genuine complexity of grief without trying to simplify or minimize it. "You sound like you speak from experience," she said, noting the way his expression had grown distant and thoughtful. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the water flowing past their feet. "Different kind of loss, but loss all the same," he said. "I've learned that the people who tell you to move on and forget are usually the ones who haven't experienced anything that fundamentally changed who they are. Real healing doesn't mean forgetting or replacing what you've lost. It means learning to carry it in a way that doesn't destroy everything else." His words settled into something deep inside Sarah, offering a framework for understanding her grief that felt both honest and hopeful in a way that nothing else had managed to achieve. She had been thinking of her recovery as a process of returning to who she had been before, but Marcus was suggesting something different, the possibility of becoming someone new who could honor her loss while still embracing whatever came next. "How do you learn to carry it differently?" she asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on the practical aspects of healing. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering not just the question, but his willingness to share the hard-won insights that had helped him survive his own encounters with loss and trauma. "Very slowly," he said finally, "and usually with help from people who understand that healing isn't linear, and that some days will always be harder than others. It helps to have something to focus on besides the pain, something that gives you a reason to keep moving forward even when you don't feel like you have the strength." "What was your something?" Sarah asked softly. "At first it was just duty," Marcus admitted. "Completing missions, fulfilling responsibilities, staying alive long enough to protect other people from experiencing similar losses. But eventually I realized that surviving wasn't the same as living, and that honoring what I'd lost meant finding ways to create meaning and beauty in whatever time I had left." He gestured toward his sketchbook, which lay closed between them on the log. "Drawing helps," he said. "It forces me to notice details about the world that I might otherwise miss, to find something worth preserving even in difficult circumstances. And conversations like this one help too. Moments when I can share parts of myself that usually stay hidden and discover that I'm not as alone as I sometimes feel." Sarah felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness but from relief at finally hearing someone articulate what she had been struggling to understand about her own healing process. The conversation with Marcus was the first time since her loss that she had felt genuinely connected to another person. The first time she had been able to imagine that her grief might eventually coexist with other emotions rather than overwhelming them entirely. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for understanding and for sharing your own experience. I've been so focused on trying to fix myself that I forgot healing might actually mean accepting that some things can't be fixed, only integrated into who I become next." Marcus reached across the space between them and gently covered her hand with his own, a gesture that was both comforting and significant in its careful restraint. "You don't need fixing, Sarah," he said softly. You need time and patience, and someone who can see your strength, even when you can't see it yourself. And for what it's worth, I think you're doing better than you realize." The warmth of his hand on hers sent something like electricity through Sarah's system. Not the sharp spark of romantic attraction, but something deeper and more stabilizing. A sense of being anchored to the present moment in a way she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt like she might actually survive the rebuilding process, not just as a diminished version of her former self, but as someone who had been fundamentally changed by loss and made stronger by the process of learning to carry it. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the water flow past and feeling the weight of the understanding that had developed between them. Neither of them was ready to name what was happening, but both recognized that they had crossed some invisible threshold from polite acquaintance to something more substantial and potentially transformative. The warrior who was supposed to break everything he touched had instead offered the most gentle and effective healing Sarah had encountered. And the woman who had thought herself beyond repair was beginning to believe that wholeness might take different forms than she had previously imagined. Part 4. Understanding the Stakes. The warm weather held for another week, drawing Sarah to the creek with increasing frequency and giving Marcus excuses to extend his patrol routes to include regular stops at their unofficial meeting place. What had begun as chance encounters had evolved into something neither quite dared to call appointments, though both found themselves planning their mornings around the possibility of continuing their conversations. On Friday morning, Sarah arrived at the creek to find Marcus sitting on the bank with his boots removed, his feet dangling in the cool water. The informal posture was so different from his usual military bearing that she almost didn't recognize him at first. He looked younger this way, more relaxed, and there was something about the scene that spoke of trust and vulnerability that made her heart flutter with nervous anticipation. "You look comfortable," she said by way of greeting, settling herself on a nearby rock and noting how the morning light caught the copper highlights in his dark hair. "It's warmer today than I expected," Marcus replied, wiggling his toes in the current with an expression of simple pleasure that was remarkably appealing. "I thought I might take advantage of the opportunity to cool off before continuing my patrol. I hope you don't mind sharing the creek with someone who's being less than perfectly dignified." Sarah laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that surprised them both with its spontaneity. "I think dignity is overrated," she said. "Besides, you've seen me elbow-deep in creek water cleaning vegetables. We're well past the point of standing on ceremony with each other." The easy familiarity in her tone made something warm unfurl in Marcus's chest, a sensation he was beginning to associate specifically with Sarah's presence. Over the past week, their conversations had grown progressively more personal and wide-ranging, touching on everything from childhood memories to philosophical questions about duty and happiness. He was starting to understand that Sarah Mitchell had one of those rare minds that could find interesting angles on almost any subject, and her perspectives often challenged him to think about familiar concepts in entirely new ways. "I've been wondering about something," Sarah said, removing her own shoes and stockings with practical efficiency and joining him in the water. Her feet were pale and surprisingly delicate, and Marcus found himself having to concentrate on keeping his attention appropriately focused on her face. "What's that?" he asked, grateful that his voice came out steady despite his awareness of her proximity and the intimate nature of their shared position. "Your work," she said, studying his expression carefully. "I understand that you scout and patrol, but I get the impression that there's more to it than you've told me. I'm not asking you to share anything you're not supposed to, but I've been thinking about what you said about learning to carry difficult experiences, and I wonder if your work involves things that are hard to carry." Marcus felt his stomach tighten at her perceptive question. He had been dreading this moment while simultaneously knowing it was inevitable. Their growing closeness made it increasingly difficult to maintain the careful omissions that had allowed him to present a sanitized version of his duties. But the full truth about his work was likely to change the way Sarah saw him, possibly in ways that would end whatever was developing between them. "You're right that there's more to it," he said slowly, buying himself time to figure out how much truth he could share without horrifying her. "Some aspects of frontier security require more direct action than simple observation and reporting. Sometimes I have to make difficult decisions about how to handle threats to civilian settlements." Sarah could hear the careful euphemisms in his explanation and recognize the tension in his posture as he spoke. She had grown up on the frontier and was not naive about the realities of life in contested territories, but she also understood that Marcus was trying to protect her from details that he thought might disturb her. "You've killed people," she said, quietly, making it a statement rather than a question. Marcus went very still, his eyes fixed on the water flowing around their feet. "Yes," he said simply, waiting for her reaction and preparing himself for the possibility that this conversation would mark the end of their morning meetings. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the confirmation of what she had suspected, but the weight of pain she could see in his expression. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle rather than shocked or accusatory. "That must be incredibly difficult to live with," she said. "Having to make those kinds of decisions. Carrying the responsibility for other people's deaths, even when you know it was necessary." Marcus looked at her with surprise, having expected judgment or revulsion rather than empathy. Most civilians either romanticized the violence associated with military service or recoiled from it entirely. But Sarah seemed to understand that the reality existed in a more complex space between heroism and horror. "It is," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. "Every time I have to take someone's life, even when I know they were threatening innocent people, a part of me dies too. I tell myself it's the price of keeping others safe, but sometimes I wonder if I'm becoming the kind of person who's too dangerous to be around decent people." Sarah felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice, recognizing the self-doubt and isolation that came from carrying moral burdens alone. She had seen the same kind of haunted expression in her father's eyes when he talked about his experiences during the war, and she understood something about the way violence could poison even the most necessary actions. "Marcus," she said softly, reaching over to cover his hand with hers, "you are not too dangerous to be around decent people. You're someone who carries terrible responsibility so that others don't have to. And the fact that it weighs on you proves that you haven't lost your humanity in the process." Her words hit him like absolution, offering a perspective on his actions that he had never been able to achieve on his own. He had spent years assuming that the necessary violence of his work was slowly corrupting him, making him unfit for normal human connections. But Sarah was suggesting that his capacity for moral anguish was actually evidence of his continued decency. "How can you be so understanding about this?" he asked, genuinely puzzled by her lack of condemnation. Most people would be horrified to learn they'd been spending time with someone who has blood on his hands. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain her perspective without revealing more about her own losses than she was ready to share. "Because I've learned that the world is more complicated than I used to think it was," she said finally. "And because I can see that whatever you've had to do in your work, you're still someone who draws pictures of sunrises and worries about strangers by creeks and remembers his grandmother with love. Those things matter more to me than anything you've done in the line of duty." Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him at her words, a loosening of the shame and isolation he had carried for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without their weight. The acceptance in Sarah's voice was like medicine for wounds he hadn't realized were still bleeding, and her ability to separate his actions from his character gave him hope that healing might be possible even for someone with his history. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words carrying far more meaning than their simplicity suggested. "I've never had anyone respond to that part of my life with such understanding." Most people either want to pretend it doesn't exist or they want to hear dramatic stories that turn real suffering into entertainment. Sarah squeezed his hand gently, a gesture that was becoming natural between them, despite the relative brevity of their acquaintance. "I don't need to pretend you're perfect to care about you, Marcus," she said simply. "Perfect people are boring. Anyway, and they don't usually have much empathy for those of us who are struggling with difficult circumstances." The casual reference to caring about him made Marcus's heart skip, but he also caught the implication that Sarah saw herself as someone who was struggling, which reminded him that he still knew relatively little about the specific circumstances of her own losses. Their conversations had revealed general outlines of grief and withdrawal, but she had been as careful with details as he had been about his work. "Can I ask you something?" he said, turning slightly so he could see her face more clearly. "You mentioned losing someone important 6 months ago, and I've been wondering if you feel comfortable sharing more about what happened. You've been so understanding about my situation, and I'd like to understand yours better if you're willing to talk about it." Sarah felt her chest tighten at the question, recognizing that the moment had come to offer her own vulnerable truth. In response to his honesty about his work, she had known this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier to find words for experiences that still felt too large and painful to fit into ordinary language. "His name was David," she said slowly, her voice steady but quiet. "We were engaged to be married, had been planning our wedding for the spring. He was a teacher, the kindest and gentlest man I'd ever met, someone who believed that education could solve most of the world's problems." She paused, gathering strength for the more difficult part of the story. Marcus waited patiently, recognizing the careful control she was exercising and the trust she was showing by sharing something so obviously painful. "He was killed in a raid on the schoolhouse where he taught," Sarah continued, her gaze fixed on the water flowing past their feet. "It was one of those random attacks that sometimes happen on the frontier. A small group of young men from one of the displaced tribes who were angry and desperate and looking for someone to blame for their losses. David tried to protect his students, and he succeeded. They all survived, but he didn't." Marcus felt his heart break for her, understanding now the specific nature of her loss and the complex emotions it must have generated. The death of a fiancé would have been devastating enough, but losing someone to the very kind of violence that Marcus himself sometimes perpetrated added layers of moral complexity that must have made her grief even more difficult to process. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That kind of senseless loss is the worst kind of tragedy, and I can't imagine how difficult it must have been to survive something like that." Sarah nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. For the first time since she had begun the story, "The hardest part wasn't just losing him," she said quietly. "It was losing my faith in the idea that good people are protected from random violence, that living with kindness and purpose provides some kind of shield against the chaos of the world. David was the best person I'd ever known, and he died for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time." Marcus understood now why his confession about his work hadn't shocked or repelled her. Sarah had already been forced to confront the reality of frontier violence in the most personal way possible, and her acceptance of his necessary actions probably came from her understanding that sometimes violence was the only response to violence, even when it created moral complications for everyone involved. "And now you're sitting here with someone whose work involves the same kind of violence that took David away from you," he said quietly. Sarah looked at Marcus with an expression that was both sad and resolute, her fingers still intertwined with his in the cool water of the creek. "The irony isn't lost on me," she said softly. "But I've had 6 months to think about violence and justice and the difference between cruelty and necessity. David wouldn't want his death to make me hate everyone who carries a weapon or does difficult work to protect others. He believed in complexity, in trying to understand all sides of every situation." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't even realized was constricted. He had been bracing himself for her to pull away, to realize that continuing any kind of relationship with him would be a betrayal of David's memory. Instead, she was offering him the same nuanced understanding that she had requested for her own grief. The recognition that healing sometimes meant learning to hold contradictory truths simultaneously. That's a remarkable way to honor his memory. Marcus said quietly. It would be easier to let his death justify hatred or fear. But choosing to maintain his capacity for empathy, even in your grief, takes incredible strength. Sarah smiled sadly, the expression transforming her face in ways that made Marcus's heart ache with protective tenderness. Some days I manage it better than others, she admitted. There are times when I'm angry at the whole world, when I want to blame everyone who has ever picked up a weapon for the fact that David isn't here anymore. But then I remember that he spent his life trying to teach children that education and understanding were more powerful than violence, and I try to live up to that ideal even when it's difficult. The water continued to flow around their feet. As they sat in contemplative silence, both processing the weight of what they had shared and the new level of intimacy it had created between them, Marcus found himself marveling at Sarah's resilience, her ability to maintain hope and compassion despite experiencing the kind of loss that might have justified a complete withdrawal from human connection. Sarah, for her part, was discovering that Marcus's capacity for violence was balanced by an equally powerful capacity for gentleness, and that the combination made him more trustworthy rather than less. I keep thinking about what you said about learning to carry difficult things differently, Sarah said eventually. I've been trying to figure out how to carry David's memory in a way that honors who he was without making it impossible for me to imagine any kind of future. Some people have told me that moving forward means letting go, but that doesn't feel right to me. Marcus nodded, understanding the distinction she was trying to make. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting or replacing what you've lost, he said thoughtfully. It means learning to integrate it into whatever comes next in a way that adds meaning rather than just pain. David will always be part of who you are, but that doesn't mean he has to be the only part that matters. The insight resonated with something deep in Sarah's chest, offering a framework for thinking about her future that felt both respectful of her past and open to new possibilities. She had been struggling with the feeling that any happiness or connection she might find would somehow diminish David's importance in her life, but Marcus was suggesting that love could expand rather than replace, that her capacity for caring about other people was not limited by her commitment to honoring her fiancé's memory. Is that how you've learned to deal with the people you've lost? She asked, curious about how he had applied this philosophy to his own experiences with grief and trauma. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering both the question and his willingness to share even more of his personal history. Some of it, he said finally. I lost my parents when I was 8, and for years I thought that staying loyal to their memory meant refusing to care about anyone else the way I had cared about them. My grandmother had to teach me that love isn't a finite resource, that caring about her didn't make me disloyal to my parents. He paused, gathering courage for a more recent and more difficult confession. I also lost someone in the line of duty about 2 years ago, he continued, his voice growing rougher with emotion. A fellow scout named Thomas, who was probably the closest friend I'd ever had. We were tracking a group of raiders who had been attacking supply convoys, and I made a tactical decision that got him killed. I've been carrying that guilt ever since, along with the feeling that I don't deserve the kind of friendship I had with him. Sarah felt her heart clench with sympathetic pain, recognizing in his words the particular anguish that came from feeling responsible for someone else's death. She could see the weight he carried in the tension of his shoulders and the careful control of his expression, and she understood that this confession represented a level of trust that he probably hadn't offered to many people. Marcus, she said gently, the fact that you feel guilty about your friend's death suggests that you made the best decision you could with the information you had at the time. Tactical decisions in dangerous situations are never perfect, and the people who share those risks understand that. I'm sure Thomas knew what he was signing up for when he chose to work with you. I know that intellectually, Marcus replied, his gaze fixed on the ripples their feet were creating in the water. But knowing something and feeling it are different things. I keep thinking that if I had been smarter or faster or more careful, he would still be alive. And I keep wondering if I have any right to form new friendships when I couldn't protect the last person who trusted me with his life. Sarah recognized the familiar pattern of survivor's guilt, the way trauma could convince people that they were responsible for things beyond their control and undeserving of whatever good things remained in their lives. She had wrestled with similar feelings about David's death, wondering if she could have somehow prevented the attack or convinced him to leave teaching for a safer profession. You know, she said thoughtfully, I think David and Thomas would probably have very similar opinions about what we owe to their memories. David always believed that the best way to honor people we've lost is to keep living fully, to keep finding meaning and connection and reasons to be grateful for whatever time we have. Withdrawing from life doesn't bring them back, but it does waste the opportunities they would want us to embrace. Marcus turned to look at her directly, struck by the wisdom in her words and the generous spirit that allowed her to offer comfort even while dealing with her own grief. You're remarkable, Sarah Mitchell, he said quietly. 6 months ago you lost the person you were planning to spend your life with. And here you are helping me figure out how to forgive myself for choices I made in impossible circumstances. How did you become so wise about healing? Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at his praise, but also a flutter of something that might have been hope. I'm not wise, she said with a slight smile. I'm just stubborn. I refuse to let the worst thing that ever happened to me be the only thing that defines the rest of my life. And talking with you helps me remember that healing doesn't have to be a solitary process, that sometimes we can help each other carry burdens that are too heavy for one person alone. The acknowledgement that they were helping each other hung in the air between them, creating a sense of partnership that was both comforting and slightly daunting in its implications. Neither of them had expected to find this kind of connection when they first encountered each other by the creek, but both were beginning to recognize that what was developing between them had the potential to be genuinely transformative. Marcus found himself studying Sarah's face in the dappled morning light, noting the way her eyes lit up when she smiled and the determined set of her chin when she talked about refusing to be defined by tragedy. She was beautiful, certainly, but more than that, she was alive in a way that called to something deep in his own spirit, something that had been dormant for so long he had almost forgotten it existed. Sarah, he said carefully, aware that he was about to venture into territory that would change the nature of their relationship regardless of her response. I need you to know that these conversations we've been having, these mornings by the creek, they've become the most important part of my life. I look forward to seeing you in a way that goes beyond simple friendship, and I think you might feel something similar. Sarah's heart began to race, not with fear but with a complex mixture of excitement and uncertainty. She had been aware of the growing attraction between them, had felt it in the way their hands seemed to find excuses to touch and in the way their conversations had become increasingly intimate, but hearing Marcus articulate it openly forced her to confront questions she hadn't been sure she was ready to answer. I do feel something, she said quietly, her honesty surprising her with its ease. I care about you in ways that go beyond what I expected to feel for anyone again. But Marcus, I'm not sure I'm ready for what that might mean. 6 months isn't very long to grieve an engagement, and I don't know if I'm capable of giving you the kind of attention and affection you deserve. Marcus felt a stab of disappointment, but it was tempered by understanding and respect for her honesty. He had known that her recent loss would complicate any romantic feelings that might develop between them, and he appreciated that she was being direct about her limitations, rather than leading him on or making promises she might not be able to keep. I understand, he said gently, his thumb tracing small circles over her knuckles. "And I want you to know that I'm not asking you to make any decisions or commitments right now. I just needed you to know how I feel, so that you could make informed choices about how much time you want to spend with me and what kind of relationship feels comfortable for you." The generosity in his response made Sarah's eyes fill with tears, moved by his willingness to prioritize her emotional needs over his own desires. In her experience, men who claimed to care about her usually became impatient or demanding when she couldn't immediately reciprocate their feelings in full measure. But Marcus was offering her space and time without any apparent resentment. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you might realize. I'm not saying no to the possibility of something more between us, but I need to take things slowly and see how my heart heals over time. Is that something you could be patient with?" Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face into something warm and hopeful. "Sarah, I've been waiting my whole life to meet someone like you. A few more months or even years. To let you heal properly seems like a small price to pay for the chance to build something real and lasting together." His words settled into her heart like seeds in fertile soil, carrying the promise of growth and new life without demanding immediate results. For the first time since David's death, Sarah found herself able to imagine a future that included not just survival but genuine happiness, not as a replacement for what she had lost, but as something entirely new and different. They sat together in comfortable silence as the morning light grew stronger around them, both processing the weight of what they had shared and the new possibilities it had created. The creek continued its gentle song, indifferent to human hopes and fears, but somehow blessing their tentative movement toward each other with its peaceful presence. Part 4. Understanding the stakes. The revelation of their mutual feelings created a subtle but significant shift in the dynamic between Sarah and Marcus. They continued to meet at the creek most mornings, but their conversations now carried an undercurrent of romantic possibility that colored even the most mundane exchanges. Marcus found himself paying attention to details he had previously overlooked. The way Sarah's hair caught the light when she laughed, the graceful movement of her hands when she gestured, the particular quality of her voice when she was thinking deeply about something he had said. Sarah, for her part, was discovering that healing didn't necessarily mean waiting until she was completely whole before allowing new experiences into her life. Her feelings for Marcus were growing stronger each day, but rather than feeling guilty about this development, she was beginning to understand that her capacity to care about him was actually evidence of her emotional recovery rather than a betrayal of David's memory. One morning, nearly 3 weeks after their conversation about their feelings for each other, Sarah arrived at the creek to find Marcus waiting with an expression of barely controlled agitation. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by something that looked like suppressed anger mixed with concern, and his horse was saddled and ready for immediate departure rather than hobbled for a leisurely grazing session. "Marcus, what's wrong?" Sarah asked immediately, recognizing the signs of professional urgency in his posture and equipment. Marcus looked at her with an expression that was both frustrated and protective, clearly struggling with how much information to share. "There's been an incident," he said carefully. "A family named Peterson was attacked at their homestead about 15 miles north of here. The parents were killed, but the children managed to escape and make it to town during the night." Sarah felt her blood turn cold, recognizing the familiar pattern of frontier violence that had claimed David's life. "How many children?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to coil in her stomach. "3, Marcus replied grimly, "ages 6, 9, and 12. They're at the church now, being cared for by Reverend Williams and his wife. But they're traumatized and have no other family in the area. The attack appears to have been carried out by the same group that's been hitting isolated settlements over the past month." "The same group," Sarah repeated, a chill running down her spine as she realized the implications. Marcus, are you saying that there's an organized band of raiders operating in this area? How long has this been going on? Marcus ran a hand through his hair, clearly debating how much truth he could safely share with a civilian. About 6 weeks, he admitted finally. We've been tracking them, but they're smart and well organized, probably led by someone with military experience. They hit fast and hard, then disappear into terrain that's difficult to follow. Last night was the closest they've come to Riverside, and it means they're getting bolder. Sarah felt her chest tighten with a familiar combination of grief and fear, remembering all too clearly the devastating impact that random violence could have on innocent families. The image of 3 orphaned children seeking refuge in the night brought back memories of her own experience with sudden loss, and she found herself wondering if the Peterson children would ever recover from what they had witnessed. What will happen to the children, she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Marcus's expression grew even grimmer. There's an orphanage in Helena, about a 3-day ride from here. It's not a particularly good place from what I've heard, but it's the only option for children with no family connections. They'll probably be sent there within the week. The thought of 3 traumatized children being shipped off to an institutional setting, where they would receive care but little individual attention, made Sarah's heart ache with protective anger. She knew from her own experience how crucial emotional support was in the aftermath of traumatic loss, and the idea of those children facing their grief alone felt almost unbearable. Marcus, she said suddenly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. What if they didn't have to go to Helena? What if someone in Riverside was willing to take them in, at least temporarily? Marcus looked at her with surprise, recognizing the direction of her thoughts and feeling both admiration for her generous impulse and concern about the practical implications. Sarah, that's a beautiful sentiment, but caring for 3 orphaned children is an enormous responsibility. It would require someone with significant resources and experience with trauma, not to mention the legal authority to make decisions about their welfare. I know it's complicated, Sarah said, her mind already working through the logistics, but it's not impossible. My family has a large house and enough land to support additional people. My mother has experience with children, and I understand something about what those children are going through. Maybe we could at least offer them a temporary home while more permanent arrangements are made. Marcus felt his heart swell with admiration for Sarah's immediate impulse to help, but he also recognized the potential dangers of her proposal. Sarah, he said gently, I think your instincts are wonderful, but you need to understand that taking in the Peterson children would put your family at risk. The raiders who killed their parents are still operating in this area, and they might target anyone who helps the survivors. Sarah looked at him with steady determination, her jaw set in a way that reminded Marcus of her stubborn refusal to let tragedy define her life. I understand the risks, she said firmly. But I also understand what it feels like to lose everything and need someone to care about what happens to you next. If my family can provide safety and stability for those children, even temporarily, then the risk is worth it. Marcus found himself caught between admiration for her courage and fear for her safety, recognizing that Sarah's generous heart was leading her toward a decision that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. The logical part of his mind knew that civilian families should not become involved in situations related to active military operations, but the part of him that was falling in love with her was moved by her immediate willingness to sacrifice her own comfort and security for the welfare of strangers. Sarah, he said carefully, even if your family is willing to take on this responsibility, you need to understand what you're asking for. Those children have witnessed things that no child should ever see, and they're going to need specialized care to help them process their trauma. They might have nightmares, behavioral problems, difficulty trusting new people. Are you prepared for that kind of challenge? Sarah thought about his question seriously, recognizing that he was trying to help her understand the full scope of what she was proposing, rather than simply discouraging her from helping. "I'm not saying it would be easy," she said finally. "But, Marcus, those children need someone who understands that healing takes time and that recovery isn't always linear. They need someone who won't give up on them when they have bad days or setbacks. I can't replace their parents or erase what happened to them, but I can offer them consistency and patience while they figure out how to keep living." The echo of their previous conversations about healing and carrying difficult experiences was not lost on Marcus, and he realized that Sarah was proposing to apply the same principles that had guided her own recovery to helping the Peterson children navigate their grief. It was a generous and potentially transformative offer, but it was also dangerous in ways that she might not fully appreciate. "What about your parents?" he asked. "Have you discussed this with them? They would be taking on significant legal and financial responsibility, not to mention the emotional burden of caring for traumatized children." Sarah shook her head, acknowledging the validity of his concern. "I haven't talked to them yet, but I know they'll be supportive once they understand the situation. My parents have always believed in helping people who need assistance, and they'll see this as an opportunity to make a real difference in those children's lives." Marcus admired her confidence in her family's generosity, but he also knew that civilian good intentions were often insufficient preparation for the complexities of frontier violence and its aftermath. The Peterson children were not just orphans in need of care. They were potential witnesses to organized criminal activity, and anyone who sheltered them could become targets themselves. "Sarah," he said seriously, "I need you to understand that this isn't just about providing temporary foster care. The people who killed the Peterson parents are still out there, and they may be watching to see who helps the survivors. If your family takes in those children, you could be putting everyone at risk, including yourself." The protective concern in his voice made Sarah's heart flutter with warmth, even as she recognized the seriousness of his warning. She could see that Marcus was torn between supporting her generous impulses and wanting to keep her safe from potential dangers, and she appreciated that he was being honest about the risks rather than simply trying to talk her out of helping. "I understand that there are dangers," she said quietly, reaching over to take his hand in hers. "But Marcus, those children are already at risk, and sending them away to an orphanage won't necessarily keep them safer. At least if they stay in Riverside, they'll be in a community where people care about their welfare, and where there are people like you working to protect them." Marcus felt his resolve wavering in the face of her logical argument and obvious determination. He knew that Sarah was right about the limitations of institutional care, and he also knew that the Peterson children would benefit enormously from the kind of individual attention and emotional support that her family could provide. But the protective instincts that had kept him alive through years of dangerous work were screaming warnings about the potential consequences of her proposal. "If your family does decide to take them in," he said finally, "I want you to promise me that you'll take every precaution to keep yourselves safe. That means following any security recommendations I give you, and it means being prepared to send the children away if the situation becomes too dangerous." Sarah squeezed his hand, moved by his willingness to support her decision despite his obvious concerns. "I promise," she said solemnly. "We'll be careful, and we'll listen to your advice about how to stay safe. But Marcus, I need to do this. I need to try to help those children, not just for their sake but for my own healing. I think this might be part of how I learned to carry David's memory in a way that creates meaning rather than just pain." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that Sarah's need to help the Peterson children was connected to her own process of recovery and growth. He could see that she had found a way to transform her experience with loss into motivation for protecting others from similar suffering. And while the practical risks were significant, the emotional logic was sound. "All right," he said quietly. "If this is what you need to do, then I'll help you figure out how to do it safely. But Sarah, you need to understand that this decision will change things between us too. If your family becomes involved in this situation, I'll be professionally obligated to prioritize your protection, which means our relationship will become more complicated. Sarah looked at him with surprise, not having considered the way her decision might affect their personal connection. What do you mean? She asked, though she suspected she understood the implications. Marcus sighed, recognizing that he was about to reveal aspects of his work that he had previously kept hidden from her. If your family takes in the Peterson children, you'll essentially become part of an active military operation, he explained. I'll be responsible for your safety in an official capacity, which means I'll have to follow protocols and make decisions based on strategic considerations rather than personal feelings. It might mean spending less time with you, or it might mean having to make choices that put duty ahead of what I want for our relationship. The weight of what he was saying settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket, forcing her to confront the reality that her generous impulses could have far-reaching consequences for everyone she cared about. She had been so focused on the immediate need to help the Peterson children that she hadn't fully considered how her decision might complicate her growing relationship with Marcus or put additional strain on his already difficult professional responsibilities. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't think about how this might affect your work or put you in a difficult position. Are you saying that I shouldn't offer to help because it would be too complicated for you professionally? Marcus shook his head quickly, recognizing that he had inadvertently made Sarah feel guilty for her generous impulses. No, he said firmly. I'm not asking you to choose between helping those children and maintaining our relationship. I'm just trying to make sure you understand all the implications of your decision so that you can make an informed choice about what you're willing to risk. He paused, then continued with obvious difficulty. Sarah, what's developing between us is important to me, more important than I expected anything to be again. But those children need help right now, and if you're in a position to provide it, then that's what matters most. We'll figure out how to navigate the complications as they arise. The generosity of his response made Sarah's eyes fill with tears, moved by his willingness to prioritize the welfare of stranger children over his own romantic interests. It was exactly the kind of selfless consideration that had made her fall for him in the first place, and it reinforced her growing conviction that Marcus Cole was the kind of man who could be trusted with her healing heart and her uncertain future. Thank you, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, for understanding why I need to do this, and for being willing to help even though it complicates things for you. It means everything to me to know that you support this decision. Marcus smiled, the expression carrying both warmth and determination. We'll make it work, Sarah, he said confidently. Whatever complications arise, we'll figure them out together. Those children deserve a chance at healing and stability, and if your family can provide that, then everything else is just logistics. As they sat together in the morning light, both contemplating the ways their lives were about to change, neither could have predicted that their decision to help the Peterson children would ultimately lead to challenges that would test not only their growing relationship, but their very survival. The stakes of their connection were about to become much higher than either had anticipated, but they were also about to discover reserves of strength and courage that neither had known they possessed. Part 5. Character Depth. The Warrior. Marcus spent the remainder of that day preparing for what he knew would be one of the most challenging assignments of his military career. Taking responsibility for the safety of a civilian family who had voluntarily placed themselves in danger required a different kind of strategic thinking than his usual work, and the personal stakes involved made it difficult to maintain the emotional distance that typically characterized his professional decisions. He began by riding to the Peterson homestead to examine the scene of the attack, looking for clues about the raiders' methods and possible future targets. The burned remains of the cabin and barn told a story of deliberate destruction rather than random violence, and the systematic way the property had been ransacked suggested that the attackers were looking for something specific rather than simply stealing whatever valuables they could find. Marcus crouched beside the cold ashes of what had been the family's home, his trained eye cataloging details that might provide insights into the raiders' identity and intentions. The attack had been carried out with military precision, with evidence of coordinated movement and strategic positioning that spoke of experienced leadership. More troubling still, the raiders had taken time to search the property thoroughly despite the risk of discovery, which suggested they were operating under orders rather than simply taking advantage of an isolated target. As he examined the tracks leading away from the homestead, Marcus found himself thinking about the conversation he had had with Sarah that morning and the courage she had shown in volunteering to help the Peterson children. Most people responded to frontier violence by becoming more cautious and protective of their own safety, but Sarah had immediately focused on what she could do to help the survivors, rather than on how to protect herself from similar attacks. It was exactly the kind of response that had made him fall in love with her, but it was also the kind of generous impulse that could get her killed if he failed to provide adequate protection. The weight of that responsibility settled over him, like a familiar burden, heavy but not unwelcome. He had spent his entire adult life protecting people from dangers they couldn't handle themselves, but this was the first time his personal happiness had been directly connected to his professional success. Marcus completed his examination of the Peterson property as the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, his notebook filled with observations and sketches that would inform his strategic planning for the protection of the Mitchell family. The raiders were clearly well organized and well armed, probably numbering between 8 and 12 men, based on the tracks and evidence of their activities. More concerning was the indication that they were operating with inside knowledge of settler routines and vulnerabilities, which suggested either extensive surveillance or information from local sources. He rode back toward Riverside with his mind occupied by tactical considerations and contingency planning. But as he approached the outskirts of town, Marcus found himself thinking less about military strategy and more about the personal courage that his work had always required. People often assumed that physical bravery was the most important quality for a frontier scout, but Marcus knew that the greater challenge was maintaining emotional availability in a profession that regularly exposed him to human suffering and moral complexity. The death of his friend Thomas 2 years earlier had taught him that caring about people made everything more difficult and more dangerous, but it also made survival more meaningful. Before Thomas, Marcus had approached his work with professional competence but emotional detachment, completing missions efficiently, but without any real investment in outcomes beyond duty fulfillment. Thomas had changed that by becoming the kind of friend who made Marcus want to come back alive from dangerous assignments, who gave him reasons to be careful that went beyond simple self-preservation. Losing Thomas had nearly convinced Marcus that emotional connections were a luxury he couldn't afford in his line of work. But meeting Sarah had challenged that conclusion by showing him that isolation wasn't really protection, just a different kind of suffering. The risk of caring about her was real and significant, but the alternative was a life so carefully controlled that it barely qualified as living at all. As Marcus reached the main street of Riverside, he could see the church where the Peterson children were currently staying, and he made a spontaneous decision to stop and assess their condition before continuing with his planning. He needed to understand their emotional state and practical needs in order to provide appropriate recommendations to the Mitchell family about what they would be taking on. Reverend Williams greeted Marcus at the church door with obvious relief, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by the strained expression of a man dealing with circumstances beyond his experience. "Corporal Cole," he said quietly, "thank goodness you're here. Those poor children are in a terrible state, and I'm not sure we're equipped to provide the kind of care they need." Marcus followed the Reverend into the church's main room, where he could see 3 small figures huddled together on a pew near the front altar. The children were clean and properly clothed, evidence of the congregation's immediate care. But their posture spoke of trauma that went far beyond physical needs. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 12, sat with her arms wrapped protectively around her two younger siblings, her eyes constantly scanning the room as if watching for new threats. "How are they doing?" Marcus asked quietly, noting the way all three children tensed at the sound of his voice despite his careful tone. "Not well," Reverend Williams admitted. "They haven't spoken more than a few words since they arrived, and they won't let anyone separate them, even for necessary activities like bathing or medical examination. The little one, the boy, he wakes up screaming every few hours, and the girl refuses to eat unless her brothers eat first." Marcus nodded, recognizing the classic symptoms of acute trauma response in children who had witnessed extreme violence. The protective behaviors and hypervigilance were normal adaptive responses to life-threatening situations, but they would require patient and specialized intervention to prevent them from becoming permanent patterns that would interfere with the children's long-term development. "Have they said anything about what they saw?" Marcus asked, though he suspected that getting information from traumatized children would require more time and skill than anyone in Riverside currently possessed. The Reverend shook his head sadly. "Just that bad men came in the night and hurt their parents, and that they hid in the root cellar until morning. The girl, Emma, she's been asking when their mama and papa are coming back, even though she saw what happened to them. I think they're still hoping this is all some kind of nightmare they'll wake up from." Marcus felt his heart clench with protective anger at the thought of what those children had endured, and he found himself understanding exactly why Sarah had been so determined to offer them better care than an institutional orphanage could provide. Children who had experienced this level of trauma needed stability, patience, and individual attention, all things that would be difficult to find in a large institutional setting. "Reverend Williams," he said quietly, "I understand that the Mitchell family has offered to take the children in temporarily. What's your opinion of that arrangement?" The Reverend's face brightened slightly for the first time since Marcus had arrived. "Oh, that would be wonderful," he said with obvious relief. "The Mitchell family is one of the most stable and generous families in our community, and Sarah particularly has such a gentle way with children. Mrs. Mitchell raised 4 children of her own, and their home would provide exactly the kind of environment these little ones need to begin healing." Marcus nodded, filing away the Reverend's assessment as he continued to observe the Peterson children. Even from across the room, he could see that they were exhausted but afraid to sleep, hungry but suspicious of food offered by strangers, and desperately in need of safety but unable to trust that safety was possible. It would take months of consistent care and patience to help them begin to recover, but Marcus could see in their faces the same resilience that he had recognized in Sarah's determination to move forward despite devastating loss. "I'm going to speak with the Mitchell family tonight about the practical arrangements," Marcus told the Reverend. "If they decide to proceed, we'll need to coordinate the transfer carefully to minimize additional trauma for the children. They've been through enough disruption for one lifetime." As Marcus left the church and continued toward the Mitchell family home, he found himself thinking about the parallels between the Peterson children's situation and his own relationship with trauma and recovery. He had been older when his parents died, old enough to understand what had happened and to participate in decisions about his future care, but he still remembered the disorienting sense of unreality that followed sudden loss, the feeling that the world had become fundamentally unsafe and unpredictable. His grandmother had saved him by providing exactly what the Peterson children needed now: consistent care, infinite patience, and the security of knowing that someone was committed to his welfare regardless of how difficult or demanding his recovery process became. She had never tried to rush his grief or minimize his fears, but she had also never allowed him to believe that trauma would define the rest of his life. The Mitchell family home was a substantial 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and Well-maintained gardens, speaking of prosperity achieved through hard work rather than inherited wealth. Marcus could see warm light spilling from the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. Domestic signs of comfort and stability that would provide exactly the kind of environment the Peterson children needed. As he approached the front door, Marcus found himself hoping that his assessment of Sarah's family would prove accurate, that they would demonstrate the same combination of generosity and practical wisdom that had made Sarah herself such an extraordinary person. The Peterson children deserved nothing less than a family who understood that healing required both emotional support and unwavering commitment, and Marcus was prepared to use all his influence to ensure they received exactly that kind of care. He knocked on the door with the careful respect of a man who understood that he was about to ask a civilian family to take on risks and responsibilities that went far beyond normal community obligations, but who also believed that some causes were worth any amount of personal sacrifice. The conversation that followed would determine not only the immediate future of 3 orphaned children, but also the next phase of his relationship with Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had taught him that healing and love were not only possible, but essential, even in the midst of a world that seemed determined to break everything beautiful it encountered. "Good evening," Sarah said softly, opening the door wide to welcome him inside. "My parents are eager to meet you properly, and we've all been discussing the situation with the Peterson children. I think you'll find that we're more prepared for this than you might expect." Marcus stepped into the warm interior of the Mitchell home, immediately struck by the atmosphere of comfortable prosperity and genuine family affection that permeated every detail of the space. The furniture was well made but practical, chosen for durability and comfort rather than ostentation, and the walls displayed a collection of family photographs and children's artwork that spoke of a household where individual accomplishments were celebrated and preserved. Rebecca Mitchell emerged from the kitchen with the graceful efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing complex domestic operations, and Marcus could immediately see where Sarah had inherited her combination of practical competence and gentle warmth. She was a woman in her late 40s with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that assessed him with the thorough attention of a mother, evaluating a potential threat to her family's welfare. "Corporal Cole," she said with formal politeness that contained an undertone of genuine welcome, "Sarah has told us a great deal about you, and we're grateful for the care you've shown our daughter during your morning conversations. Please, come sit by the fire and tell us what we need to know about these poor children who need our help." Thomas Mitchell rose from his chair by the fireplace as they entered the main living area, extending his hand with the firm grip of a man who had built his prosperity through honest labor and careful judgment. He was tall and broad-shouldered like his daughter, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent significant time outdoors, and his eyes held the same steady intelligence that Marcus had learned to appreciate in Sarah. "Corporal," he said, "simply, we understand that taking in the Peterson children would involve some risk to our family's safety. We'd like to hear your honest assessment of what we'd be taking on, both in terms of caring for traumatized children and protecting ourselves from whatever dangers might follow." Marcus appreciated the directness of Thomas Mitchell's question and the obvious thought that had gone into the family's preparation for this conversation. He settled into the chair they indicated and spent several minutes outlining the tactical situation as he understood it, explaining the evidence that suggested the raiders were well organized and possibly operating with inside information about settler vulnerabilities. "The group we're dealing with isn't a random collection of desperate men looking for easy targets," he explained carefully. "They're disciplined, well-armed, and they appear to be operating under specific orders rather than simply taking advantage of opportunities. The attack on the Peterson family was systematic and thorough, which suggests they were looking for something particular rather than just stealing whatever they could find." Rebecca Mitchell leaned forward in her chair, her expression growing more concerned as she processed the implications of Marcus's assessment. "Are you saying that the Peterson family was specifically targeted for some reason?" she asked. "That this wasn't just bad luck and poor timing?" Marcus nodded grimly, recognizing that his honesty about the dangers involved might persuade the Mitchell family to reconsider their generous offer. "I believe that's exactly what I'm saying," he confirmed. "Which means that anyone who helps the surviving children could also become a target, especially if the raiders believe the children witnessed something that could identify them or reveal their operational methods." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anxiety, but her resolve to help the Peterson children remained unchanged. She had known that taking them in would involve risks, but hearing Marcus articulate the specific dangers made the potential consequences feel more immediate and personal. "What kind of protection could you provide if we decide to proceed?" Thomas Mitchell asked, his tone suggesting that he was still considering the proposal despite the obvious dangers involved. Marcus had spent the afternoon developing security protocols specifically for this situation, and he was prepared with detailed recommendations that would minimize the risks, while still allowing the Mitchell family to provide care for the children. "I would station myself here for the duration of the threat," he said simply. "Your property would become part of my official patrol route, which means regular military presence and immediate response capability if any problems arise." He paused, then continued with the careful precision of someone who had thought through every aspect of the arrangement. "Additionally, I would recommend modifications to your daily routines that would make it more difficult for hostile forces to predict your family's movements or find opportunities to attack. These would include changes to travel patterns, communication protocols, and emergency procedures that everyone in the household would need to follow consistently." Sarah felt her heart skip at Marcus's casual mention of stationing himself at their property, recognizing the implications for their developing relationship as well as for their family's security. Having him present on a daily basis would certainly complicate the careful pace they had established for their romantic connection, but it would also provide opportunities for deeper intimacy that their current arrangement of occasional morning meetings could not offer. "Corporal Cole," Rebecca Mitchell said thoughtfully, "it sounds like you're proposing to essentially move into our home for an indefinite period. That's an enormous commitment on your part, and we need to understand why you're willing to make such a sacrifice for our family and for children you've never met." Marcus felt heat rise in his face as he recognized that Sarah's mother was politely but directly questioning his motivations and his professional judgment. He had expected this line of inquiry, but articulating his feelings for Sarah in front of her parents felt premature and potentially inappropriate given the serious nature of their discussion. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said carefully, "my primary motivation is professional responsibility for civilian safety in my assigned territory. The Peterson children are potential witnesses to organized criminal activity, which makes their protection a legitimate military concern. Beyond that, your family has volunteered to take on a burden that rightfully belongs to official channels, and I believe that generosity deserves whatever support I can provide." It was a diplomatically worded response that was also completely truthful, though it omitted the personal feelings that had made his decision to protect the Mitchell family feel like the most important assignment of his career. Sarah caught his eye across the room and smiled slightly, recognizing his careful navigation of her mother's probing questions. Thomas Mitchell stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening landscape as he considered the full scope of what they were discussing. Finally, he turned back to the group with the expression of a man who had reached a difficult but necessary decision. "Corporal Cole," he said formally, "if you're willing to provide the protection you've described, then we're willing to take in the Peterson children for as long as they need care. My wife and I have raised 4 children of our own, and we understand something about the patience and consistency that traumatized young ones require. We also understand that some responsibilities are more important than personal safety." Rebecca Mitchell nodded her agreement, her expression showing both determination and maternal concern. Those children have already lost everything that mattered to them, she said quietly. If we can provide them with stability and love while they heal, then whatever risks we face are worth it. Children shouldn't have to recover from trauma alone, especially when there are people willing and able to help. Marcus felt a surge of admiration for the Mitchell family's courage and generosity, recognizing that their decision to help the Peterson children reflected the same kind of principled commitment to community welfare that had drawn him to Sarah in the first place. These were people who understood that civilization required individuals to sometimes sacrifice personal comfort for the greater good, and their willingness to embrace both responsibility and risk reminded him why frontier communities like Riverside were worth protecting. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying far more weight than their brevity suggested. "I'll begin making arrangements immediately for the children's transfer and for implementing the security measures we discussed. With your permission, I'd like to start by modifying your property's defensive capabilities and establishing communication protocols with the fort." Over the following week, Marcus threw himself into the complex logistics of establishing the Mitchell home as a secure location while simultaneously caring for 3 traumatized children. The work required him to balance military efficiency with sensitivity to civilian sensibilities, creating protection systems that were effective without being intrusive or frightening to children who had already experienced too much violence. The Peterson children arrived on a Tuesday morning, transported from the church in a wagon driven by Reverend Williams and accompanied by Marcus on horseback. Emma, the 12-year-old, maintained her protective vigilance over her younger brothers throughout the journey, but Marcus could see her beginning to relax slightly as they approached the welcoming sight of the Mitchell home with its flower gardens and cheerful yellow curtains. Rebecca Mitchell met them at the front door with the calm efficiency of an experienced mother, speaking to the children in gentle tones that conveyed both authority and kindness. She had prepared a special room for them with 3 beds arranged close together, understanding instinctively that separation would increase their anxiety rather than helping them adjust to their new environment. Sarah had spent days preparing for the children's arrival, using her needlework skills to create small comforts that might help them feel welcome and secure. She had embroidered pillowcases with their names and sewn small stuffed animals from scraps of colorful fabric, gifts that were personal enough to show individual attention, but not so elaborate as to overwhelm children who were struggling to process their changed circumstances. The integration of the Peterson children into the Mitchell household proved to be both more challenging and more rewarding than anyone had anticipated. Emma's protective instincts made her suspicious of any attempt to separate her from her brothers, even for activities like bathing or medical examinations that required individual attention. 9-year-old Michael had developed a stutter that made communication difficult, while 6-year-old Daniel refused to speak at all, communicating only through gestures and the occasional whispered word to his siblings. Marcus found himself serving multiple roles during this period, functioning simultaneously as military security, child advocate, and increasingly important member of the Mitchell family dynamic. His presence provided reassurance to the traumatized children, who responded positively to his calm authority and obvious commitment to their protection, while his growing relationship with Sarah added emotional complexity to an already demanding situation. The security arrangements Marcus had implemented proved their worth within the first month when his surveillance network detected suspicious activity near the Mitchell property. A group of men had been observed watching the house from a distance, apparently gathering information about the family's routines and the presence of the Peterson children. Marcus's immediate response prevented any direct confrontation, but the incident confirmed that the threats he had warned about were real and ongoing. Sarah found herself adapting to the constant awareness of danger with surprising resilience, discovering that her determination to protect the children overrode her natural anxiety about personal safety. She developed new routines that incorporated Marcus's security recommendations while still maintaining the warm, stable environment that the children needed for their emotional recovery. The most challenging aspect of the arrangement proved to be navigating her developing relationship with Marcus, while maintaining appropriate boundaries in front of the children and her parents. Their morning conversations by the creek were no longer possible, but they found new opportunities for private communication during his evening security rounds and the brief moments when both were free from childcare responsibilities. One evening, in late spring, nearly 2 months after the Peterson children had come to live with them, Sarah found Marcus sitting on the front porch after completing his nightly patrol of the property perimeter. The children were finally sleeping peacefully through most nights, a sign of healing that filled everyone in the household with cautious optimism. "You look tired," she said softly, settling into the chair beside him and noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes that spoke of weeks of hypervigilance and divided attention. "It's been a long few months," Marcus admitted, allowing himself a moment of honest vulnerability now that they were alone and the immediate area was secure. "I knew that protecting your family would be challenging, but I didn't anticipate how emotionally invested I'd become in the children's recovery as well as their safety." Sarah smiled, recognizing the gentle way Marcus had inserted himself into the children's daily lives, despite his lack of experience with traumatized young people. He had proven to be remarkably patient with Emma's protective suspicions, Michael's communication difficulties, and Daniel's selective muteness, finding ways to connect with each child that respected their individual coping mechanisms. "They trust you," she observed. "I've watched them begin to seek you out when they're frightened or confused, and I think your presence has been almost as important as the stability we've tried to provide. You've shown them that it's possible for adults to be both strong and gentle, which is probably something they needed to see after witnessing so much violence." Marcus felt warmth spread through his chest at her words, moved by her recognition of his efforts with the children and her understanding of what those efforts had cost him emotionally. He had approached his protective duties with professional competence, but Sarah was right that his feelings for the Peterson children had become genuinely paternal rather than simply professional. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to know that these months of living with your family and caring for those children have changed me in ways I didn't expect. I came here to provide security and fulfill my military obligations, but I've discovered what it means to be part of something larger than individual survival or duty completion." Sarah turned to look at him more directly, recognizing the significance of what he was trying to tell her, and feeling her own emotions respond to the vulnerability in his voice. "What does that mean for you?" she asked gently. "For us," Marcus was quiet for a moment, gathering courage for the conversation he'd been wanting to have for weeks, but hadn't found the right opportunity to initiate. "It means that I don't want this arrangement to be temporary," he said finally. "I want to stay here, to continue protecting your family and helping raise those children. Not because it's my duty, but because this has become my home and you've all become my family." The simple honesty of his declaration made Sarah's heart race with a mixture of joy and uncertainty, recognizing that he was offering her not just romantic commitment, but integration into the life she had built with her family and the Peterson children. It was more than she had dared to hope for and exactly what she had been slowly realizing she wanted. "Marcus," she said softly, "are you asking me to marry you?" He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face into something warm and hopeful and completely vulnerable. "I'm asking you to build a life with me," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to let me help you raise Emma and Michael and Daniel, and to trust me with whatever healing still needs to happen in your heart. I'm asking you to believe that what we've found together is worth making permanent, even though neither of us planned for it to happen." Sarah felt tears gather in her eyes, moved by the completeness of what he was offering and the courage it had taken him to articulate feelings that made him vulnerable to rejection or disappointment. She had been gradually coming to the same conclusion about their relationship, recognizing that her feelings for Marcus had grown far beyond what she had thought possible after losing David. Yes, she said simply, the word carrying all the hope and determination and love that had been building in her heart over months of shared responsibility and growing intimacy. Yes, I want to build a life with you, and I want you to stay here with all of us. I want to marry you and raise those children together and find out what kind of future we can create when we're not just surviving but actually living. Marcus reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers with the same gentle care he had shown during all their previous moments of connection. The future that stretched ahead of them would undoubtedly include challenges and uncertainties, but it would also include the kind of deep partnership that both had thought might be impossible after their respective experiences with loss and trauma. From inside the house came the sound of young voices calling for Sarah, evidence that the Peterson children were experiencing another of the nightmares that still occasionally disrupted their sleep. Despite months of healing, Sarah and Marcus rose together to respond to their needs, moving with the coordinated efficiency of partners who had learned to work together in service of something larger than themselves. As they entered the house to comfort frightened children and restore the sense of safety that made healing possible, both Sarah and Marcus understood that they had found something precious and rare, the opportunity to transform their individual experiences with loss into a shared commitment to protection, nurturing, and love. The warrior who had been expected to break everything he touched had instead become a gentle force for healing, proving that sometimes the most profound strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the patience to help others rebuild their shattered worlds one careful stitch at a time. The Peterson children would grow up in a home where they learned that love could exist alongside vigilance, that safety could coexist with growth, and that families could be created through choice and commitment as surely as through blood and tradition. They would carry forward the lessons they learned from watching Sarah and Marcus navigate the complex process of building something beautiful from the fragments of their previous losses, understanding that healing was not about forgetting the past but about integrating it into a future that honored both memory and hope. Years later, when Emma Peterson Cole had children of her own to protect and nurture, she would tell them stories about the warrior who had saved her family by teaching them that love was the strongest defense against a world that sometimes seemed determined to break everything precious it encountered. She would tell them about the woman who had opened her home and heart to strangers because she understood that healing was a gift that multiplied when it was shared, and about the kind of courage it took to choose hope over fear, even when hope seemed like the more dangerous option. The love story that had begun with chance meetings by a quiet creek had become something larger and more enduring than either Sarah or Marcus had dared to imagine, proving that sometimes the most profound transformations happen not through dramatic gestures but through the patient accumulation of small acts of care, protection, and unwavering commitment to each other's healing. They had learned that mending broken hearts required not just time and understanding but the willingness to trust that love could grow strong enough to shelter not just themselves, but everyone they chose to include in their expanding definition of family. In the end, the warrior's greatest victory was not won on any battlefield, but in the quiet moments of domestic life when traumatized children slept peacefully because they knew they were protected, when a woman who had thought herself permanently broken discovered new capacities for joy and partnership, and when a man who had carried violence and guilt for so long learned that his hands were capable of infinite gentleness when guided by love rather than duty. The patience with which Marcus had stitched Sarah's heart back together had created not just healing but transformation, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons against despair are kindness, consistency, and the revolutionary belief that everyone deserves the chance to be whole. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.